I'm going to be moderating a fabulous panel on evaluating cybersecurity gaps across the value chain. As we've seen over the last few years, many of you now are involved to some degree in data protection, information security, and other kinds of issues that touch a broad set of important data, intellectual property of your companies. We're going to start with just a few data points to set the context for the next session. Again, drawing upon the world's most ethical company data set, 84% of those companies review third-party data protection practices in due diligence. This has become just a normal course of your company's practices. And there are many statistics on breaches stemming from a third party. The Cyber Readiness Institute has the figure at 53% of data breaches in 2018 were related to some third party as the vector in getting into the network of the company that was attacked or the organization that was attacked. I am joined by an esteemed panel of experts today representing different disciplines and different sectors. Value chain partners, the focus of our panel, and those can be vendors, supply chain partners, distributors, law firms, contractors, all handle sensitive company information, whether it's PII, trade secrets, financial information, confidential business email, and have access to your corporate networks. There are increasingly regulatory requirements to assess and monitor high-risk third parties' cyber risk management capabilities, whether you're in financial services, the health sector, defense, IT, cloud services. These regulatory requirements are quickly changing into and being spread out throughout all sectors in terms of increasing contractual requirements, including the requirement that a vendor has some level of cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is just one way companies are trying to mitigate the cyber risk of their third parties. So our panel is going to discuss these approaches to mitigating cyber risk of third parties. We're going to start with each of our panelists introducing themselves and how they work cross-functionally in their companies. As moderator, I'm then going to moderate a discussion amongst the four of us, and then we'll have time to open it up to the audience for questions. So Paul, if you could start us.
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Pamela. Thanks. It's great to be here. Just a quick introduction. Paul Ryan. I am part of the Global Security and Resilience Organization leadership team at Dell Technologies. I have a dual role, which is Chief Security Officer of Dell Financial Services. And just to give you a bit of background on our program, we cover not just cybersecurity. Security transformation is built around physical security, enterprise resilience, product security, which is of utmost importance to us, all underpinned by governance, risk, and compliance, and our supply chain security program. So those dimensions or capabilities make up the security program at Dell Technologies. And I guess from my perspective, as a CISO, as a practitioner, as a security practitioner, I typically view the world through a security-related business risk, okay? And there are probably three components to that which I monitor, track, and trend that could potentially impact business operation or have material impact from a business risk perspective. The first is threats. Threat actors are increasing in size and capability. Security vendors are tracking hundreds of new threat actors. SecureWorks alone are now tracking 200 active threat groups. The sophistication, I would argue, has not increased of threat actors, given that the availability of malware on the dark web makes it very easy for threat groups to attain malware to target against companies. The persistence is still there. So we see a lot of persistence with threat groups. So while the sophistication may not be there, they're very persistent. The second part we consider are vulnerabilities. So hands up here who would have heard or come across the phrase, people are the weakest link. Yeah, that is somewhat true. However, when we typically hear or see of breaches, the attack vector is not the person. It is the person is the initial phase, but ultimately an attacker is exploiting a software vulnerability. So that brings me on to the third point. On vulnerabilities, we're seeing a massive growth in the attack surface, given the adoption of Internet of Things, the speed to get new devices to market without the consideration for security has given rise to a huge amount of vulnerabilities that allow attackers to exploit. So this year alone, the National Vulnerability Database, we're seeing record numbers of vulnerabilities. 20,000 zero-day vulnerabilities exist in the market today. So just for context, a zero-day vulnerability is a vulnerability which has no patch. So it exists in the ecosystem, but there is no patch to prevent somebody exploiting it. So then finally, we have the consequences, and these are the things that keep me awake at night. The reputational damage that organizations can suffer as a result of a cyber attack, the above-the-surface damages, the class action lawsuits, the customer confidence, consumer confidence, but there are also below-the-surface impacts of cyber breaches. There is employee morale, there is the cost of cleanup, there is the cost of rebuilding not just confidence in consumers, but also confidence in your security programs, which can be very, very costly. And then finally, one point was around the detection gap. So it is still taking, on average, 77 to 80 days to detect an intrusion on a network, on infrastructure. So we've come a long way over the last couple of years where organizations have got better at detecting and preventing threats, but advanced persistent actors will sit on infrastructure and networks for up to a period of 80 days before they can be detected. So that presents a huge challenge. And I think the mindset of how we're starting to shift our security strategies away from protecting our boundary defenses and our endpoints is now moving to a more capabilities where we're threat hunting, we're using threat intelligence, we're starting to look for indicators of compromise so we can detect these issues before we hear about them from someone else. So there are some strategies that we're looking at around advanced persistent threats. Supply chain is a massive focus area for us. We put a premium on suppliers that have access to our corporate networks and our critical information, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
Great, thank you, Paul. Rachel?
Rachel Armstrong. I'm the global legal lead of our security business at Accenture. So my lens is a little different. I work sometimes with our CISO, so like Paul, but much more involved with actually our cyber security business. So my chief client is our global business lead, Kelly Bissell. And that business, I predominantly help them with go-to-market strategy. So they're there to help clients better defend themselves, and also to build resilience in the event that they suffer a cyber incident. So Accenture sells security services in a whole end-to-end way, from consulting type assessment work for clients who need help to understand where do they sit against any particular security standard that they want to follow. We might do high-value consulting when they're looking at target companies. We'll do the M&A due diligence, security due diligence when they want to understand the security posture of a target that they're acquiring. M&A, we've seen in the press, is one of the areas, I guess, in the ecosystem where cyber threat can create vulnerabilities to an organization. And then we have services for testing, so standard pen testing, but then all the way up to advanced adversary simulation, which is essentially using real-world hacker techniques. And I advise the business on how they do that. There might be stepped up scenarios that a client wants us to do once we've hacked into their system. And I'll give you an example. One of our financial services clients, actually several of them now, have asked, once we've hacked in, could we do a staged theft of assets to see if we could actually perform what, C-suite of banks so understandably worry about, which is if a hacker could come in and actually move very large tranches of money out of the bank. And then there's incident response, so forensic analysis, remediation, planning when a client or an organization suffers a security incident, helping them with their remediation strategy, understanding why the attack happened and obviously how to stem the bleeding as quickly as possible. Lots of services around digital identity and application security, and then managed security. So actually sometimes designing and standing up a SOC, a security operations center for a client, and then actually managing their security services for them. So they're monitoring security events, event handling, incident management, that type of thing. There's a full suite of things. So I help the business determine how do we go to market with that, what's our own risk profile in that, how are we going to contract for those services, and the things we need to take care of from a delivery perspective, what regulatory environment there is, licensing regime for some of these services, what the litigation landscape is like, what the geopolitical context is like. It's always evolving. So it's a fascinating area. Compliance, obviously, very challenging in an area where regulation is often very far behind, and actually with a global lens as well. So, looking very much to the US, the UK, and across the globe. Then on the other side, although I do to a much less capacity, I have also helped advise on Accenture's own crisis management response. So with our CISO, making sure that cross-functionally, do our plans work? We have tabletop exercises to test them, and making sure that our marketing and communications function and leadership is in the loop in the event that there is any incident to manage. Our general counsel, our CISO, obviously, and our C-suite, and sometimes the board. And what role do people play? What decisions will be made and by whom? Testing all of that out. And as we do for clients, we practice that internally too. So I have some perspective on what Accenture does internally from our own risk management perspective, and indeed with regard to supply chain. But my lens is really more through helping the business sell these services to help our clients manage and operate in this complex and ever-changing space.
Thank you, Rachel. And Mark, you're new to AIG, but certainly not the insurance industry. And cyber insurance has been in the marketplace for many, many years, but still it's very early days for cyber insurance.
That's correct. Thanks, Pamela. So Mark Bannon, AIG UK. I have a completely different lens to my colleagues here on the panel. I'm really representing the insurance market, and we're looking at all of these risks and trying to understand how do the insurance markets respond to these exposures that are facing industry. In other words, what's insurable, and how can we service that and take all of that moving dynamic that is cyber risk. It's a very broad spectrum. Translating that into business insurable risks, potentially under certain circumstances providing the appropriate level of insurance coverages. I spend most of my time talking directly to major customers, and in the period of discussions where we're trying to identify what is actually keeping most boards up at night, that whole discussion has moved so far beyond data breach. It's moved into some really interesting areas, such as the actual financial impact to businesses in terms of lost revenues, lost profits, lost productivity. So we're talking here about the interruption to normal business operations and what is the financial impact of that event occurring. That is possibly becoming the most important factor now for most organizations. Yes, data breach is a given. It's an understood exposure to the large part. But it's really now the discussion from an insurance standpoint in terms of responding to customers' requests is really helping businesses get back up and running again as quickly as possible. and trying to get that revenue stream flowing back to the levels it was prior to the event occurring in the first instance. That's one interesting dynamic. The other interesting dynamic that's developing, and Paul has touched on it, we are seeing a significant uptick in business email compromising. That is really significant. We do a lot of research into this space of understanding where are all of these insurable losses coming from. Are they business email compromising? Are they ransomware? Are they cyber extortion demands? And so on and so on. But one of the notable increases in the past 12 months has been a significant jump in business email compromising. Right now, if we look at our statistics for Europe, we're seeing about 23% of all cyber losses in Europe are coming from business email compromising. Paul just touched on it. How many people think that it's the human behaviors? Are people the problem? What sits between the keyboard and the seat? Is that the problem? Yes, in part. But to the most part, there are significant vulnerabilities still in existence across a number of networks. For a whole variety of different reasons, are still not being addressed. Aside from that, as insurers, we have a responsibility and a role to play in assisting companies and organizations understand how we can help in that crisis. And what I mean by that is it's not just simply about paying a claim. There is so much beyond just paying the claim. For example, when we do see major event, whether it be a significant data breach or a significant cyber extortion ransom demand that renders, say, for example, a manufacturing company's business inoperable for several hours or days or even weeks, those organizations are in a deep crisis. And a large number of companies do have a lot of capability to deal with these crises. But companies like AIG and many of our peers in the insurance market have seen quite a number of these large events unfold. We are understanding of the dynamics that develop. And it never ceases to amaze us, even though a lot of companies do a lot of tabletop exercises and war room analysis of how we would respond in certain given scenarios. We still find many companies are frantically trying to understand how they would deal with it. So the insurance market are developing solutions and have developed solutions that wrap around those crises and take the problem away from the boardroom table and help manage the problem in a controlled environment, allowing the C-suite to operate the business as best they can in a crisis mode. That looks like, for example, key legal services, key IT forensics, IT security experts, and a whole host of different professions and vendors available to assist businesses. Now, many organizations do have very tightly established vendor relationships, but we have access to some of the largest capabilities in the world, some of the leading experts in this field who work with some of the notable governments. And there is a lot of value add that we can introduce to that. When I say we, I'm talking here from the insurance market's perspective. The other flip side to this is the negative PR consequences. There's a lot to be said around what you say, how you say, and sometimes saying nothing might be the best option. And that might sound a bit of a strange comment to make, but knowing when to say something is really important. Until you've got the facts, until you've understood the dynamics of what's developing within the organization in that crisis, then and only then is the appropriate time to start going public in a major way. But until then, control the story and manage how you behave as a corporation in that space. It can help manage the future impact, the financial impact to the business, to the future stock levels, the valuation of the business. We see all sorts of dynamics develop out of crises like this, which don't just occur and develop in those immediate couple of hours, days, or weeks. We see certain scenarios that can continue on for many, many weeks or even months after the event. So brand reputation is really, really important in these situations, particularly if you're a major blue chip.
Can I just add, though, absolutely agree with what you're saying. Of course, PR in the context of a cyber incident is really important, and we work with cyber insurers in fact, to do that type of activity, managing panels of law firms, PR, loss adjusters, etc. But I think actually from a compliance perspective, it also has to be balanced with breach notification requirements. So really difficult for organizations in a crisis situation. On the one hand, they have their duties to the regulator to notify in the event of a significant or data breach. And they may also be, a highly regulated industry who then will be caught by the NIST directive and other regulatory compliance notification requirements. So that cross-functional approach, making sure that there is legal with the business, with the CISO, with Marcom, also knowing your cyber insurance posture and having that, to hand, all really key in the event of a cyber incident.
I was just going to add one point to that. It's interesting the way we're talking about the event has already occurred. And I think that's something that, we've become accustomed to, which I refer to as breach fatigue. So we read and we hear about cyber breaches every day. We hear about their impacts. So the conversation has actually shifted much more around how we deal with the impacts, and that that shift is...
How you respond and recover.
Yeah, respond and recover is one, but preparation is key for that too. So all the points the guys have made are very relevant and valid, but the topic of conversation has certainly changed from how we protect to how we respond.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all for your great introductory comments. But let's step back and let's really talk about the threat environment, specifically as it relates to third parties, because there's quite a bit of focus today on supply chains and using a business partner in the value chain to actually get into a larger global company. What are you seeing and hearing? How is that threat environment changing vis-a-vis third-party risk? Rachel, you want to start?
Sure. So our intelligence business, iDefense, has done a lot of research in this space and published their report in August around predictions for the changing threat landscape. I think it's really interesting, and it boils down to sort of 5 key areas. The piece I think that is of most concern is the geopolitical context and how threat actors are actually really utilizing legitimate tools, so social media networks, rather than just the malicious code and the vulnerabilities that we've been talking about, actually utilizing legitimate tools to change hearts and minds. And I think in the context of changing technology, if you take, for example, a financial services client that has a trading algorithm that relies on very text-heavy data in order to operate properly, one of the things that's a concern and seen as an emerging threat in the landscape is actually misinformation being used to feed that algorithm and changing the outcome that comes from that algorithm. So actually impacting financial markets. So really moved a long way from data breaches and just still obviously a concern, but credit card information being sold on the dark net. Then, of course, in the context of the supply chain, as organizations have invested heavily and successfully in supporting and improving their own resilience and security posture, threat actors are adapting, and we have to continue to adapt because cybercrime is not a one-incident crime. It's not a one-time event. And so the criminals themselves are very adaptable, and we all need to pivot. And I think in the space of supply chain, that's very difficult. Organizations like my own invest heavily in training for each of the near 500,000 employees. We all have a role to play in the security and the integrity of information in our organization. But having assessments of your supply chain, understanding where your data sits, how is your data classified, who are the vendors that have access to your network, how are you monitoring and assessing them, I think that's all critical to success and resilience in this space. There's also the threat of continued and emerging ransomware, and I think what we're seeing around ransomware attacks is that some ransomware attacks like WannaCry, which I'm sure many of you will have read about in the press, and obviously that had a crippling impact on our National Health Service, is that some of that ransomware is self-propagating and actually could re-emerge to cause continued problems for organizations. There's also a trend that criminals are selling access access to corporate networks. So the ransomware attacks themselves are not necessarily targeted anymore or limited to just the extortion element, but actually they're creating an attack over the entire network. So I think that's some of the main trends. There's also, I'm sure you'll all have read about Meltdown and Spectre in respect of computer processing and the cloud environment. And there are patches and well-known remedies for fixing the issues there, but that can slow processing times. So businesses may need to invest in more computer processing power. So all of these trends, I think, still continue to exploit human error and to use malware and the vulnerabilities that exist in software. Software has never been bug or error-free, and it continues to contain vulnerabilities. And there are good things like responsible disclosure programs, where if we find vulnerabilities, we tell a vendor that we found a vulnerability and we help them fix it. And there are many others, organizations, ethical organizations, who do the same. But it's understanding your landscape and the threats that emerge and testing that against standards, and so having data to measure how your supply chain is operating too that matters.
So, Paul, in this very intense threat environment, companies are going through a massive digital transformation. They're pushing their supply chain partners to also do so, to drive efficiencies and scale. So you have more intensity around digitization. What are you seeing in that context?
Yeah, and you even wrap the regulation around that, and then it becomes entirely complex. And we do have a reliance, we do trust our supply chains, and that's just the nature of the business ecosystem today. It's the nature of digital transformation. So, I look at that as another risk, okay? So supply chain risk is a business risk, and it needs to be treated as such. So how do we measure that risk? So, we talked about some of the processes, the approaches, and I think, we're starting to see some evolvements that, we have a trust-based system with suppliers, but, do we really trust them? How do we validate that trust? And that is, I think that is something that organizations struggle with a little bit. So, what we're seeing is a shift towards static-based assessments, and that's typically how, through the vendor lifecycle, we, as we onboard or continually manage, as we look at frameworks like NIST, like the ISO 27001 frameworks. We stipulate what we want as security requirements as a, in that contract, and then we hold them to account on that. But, it's continually assessing, and when we identify risks through those assessments, it's not the responsibility of the security teams to own and manage those risks. It's the relationship owners, the business partners, to determine, based on their own risk appetite, how they close them out. And from a security perspective, what we're starting to move, we certainly, assessments are still a very good baseline to understand that the supply chain security posture, but augmenting that with additional tools like surface monitoring, and that's something that we've seen in the industry with a number of companies that are adopting or utilizing. And those capabilities allow us, it puts a little bit of, it puts more power back on for us to be able to identify where there might be weaknesses that an assessment didn't show up. So the surface monitoring tools kind of, they gather public information around our supply chain and third parties, and it allows us to, it gives me data-driven insights on how they're managing and patching vulnerabilities, for example. So the conversations with our vendors become much more focused when we understand where the potential risk is. And that is, that is something that we've done, which has been quite effective. So.
And Mark, there's been so much focus on the protection of PII. GDPR has really, set the framework in terms of what corporations, what organizations have to do about protecting essentially PII and related data. But there's so many other kinds of information and data that these threat actors are quite interested in. We've talked today just about business email, the day-to-day business email that has lots of different competitive and sensitive information. So when you're looking at potential policyholders, when you're working with your policyholders, how do you engage with them about really understanding their data, where it is, who has access to it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And when we talk about information and data, it's a valuable commodity to a lot of businesses and enterprise and industry. And we are going into the realms here of industrial espionage, corporate espionage environment. When we are talking, as insurers, when we're talking to businesses around their requirements for insurance, we spend a lot of time looking into third-party relationships, not just on the IT side, but non-IT side also. And we see this as the soft underbelly of exposure. This is where we see the weak points. 9 times out of 10, when we have conversations with potential buyers of cyber insurance coverage, it is around this type of area where we see some weaknesses. Some of those weaknesses may seem on the surface to be relatively benign, but could have quite significant impacts to the operations of that organization. So to give you an example, the best way to paraphrase this, we could be the insurer, for example, of an industrial business who knows where to source their raw materials. They know where to source alternative plant and machinery if they have a fire to their premises. Those businesses can tell you in great detail where they can get alternative sources of raw materials and plant and equipment and machinery if they ever suffer a major incident at the production facilities. When we translate that same conversation into the space of, well, tell me a little bit about where do you store data? Do you know what data you have stored and where? Who is managing that for you? And those organizations that you're using to manage those environments and that data, what relationships have they got in the delivery of those solutions to you? And I have to say, it really is concerning when we talk to organizations that they can tell you a lot of detail around their business operations in a manufacturing sense, around raw materials and alternative plant machinery being sourced. But when we get into the detail around data, IT resilience, IT security, it becomes a little bit more fuzzy. And as insurers of risk, we are a bit concerned about that. We're concerned because it's telling us that the conversations that are taking place within organizations are not mature enough. They're not developing enough into the space of understanding, well, what is our IT risk? What is our cybersecurity posture right now? A lot of companies are making good effort in this space, but this is a really, really tough area for insurers, because what I'm talking about here and what I'm alluding to is helping businesses regain normal operation capability, getting revenues back into place following a major event. And when we're getting into a discussion with buyers of insurance, it's quite common to be requested for coverage around the supply chain. And we don't often get rich enough answers to describe how does that supply chain work? How does it look in terms of understanding where your data is? Where does that environment begin and end in terms of responsibilities and liabilities? And what contractually have you got in place between you and your suppliers in the delivery of those solutions? It's an extremely complex area. And again, as Paul has said, you wrap around the regulatory environment, it's a real nightmare for a lot of organizations. Now, the insurance industry is always been seen as an industry who's looking for so much information to arrive at an underwriting price of a risk. We believe in data. Data is fundamental to everything we do. We need data to model, and model determines the probability and the likelihood of risks maturing, and that's how we price risk. But if we've no access to the data, it makes our jobs a lot more difficult in understanding what that risk looks like and in determining how to price that risk correctly. There are solutions available. The insurance markets are responding to these requests. But one of the key messages I wanted to convey to all of you here in the audience to have a think about is really try to appreciate why the insurance markets need this information. It's going so far beyond your normal operation capabilities of understanding where product comes from, raw materials, and alternative plant machinery equipment. We really need to understand, what is that supply chain connectivity looking like? Do you know first level, second level, tertiary level? And who else is involved in that supply chain? Frameworks. Are the frameworks you adopt at an enterprise level cascaded down into that supply chain? How deep in the supply chain is that cascaded down? Validation checks, frequency. What do you do if you find a problem and it happens to be a critical supplier to your business? Tough decisions, commercial decisions, political decisions, they all come into the discussion.
I mean,
So it's a complex area.
Part of the challenge is for whether you're a manufacturer or a service provider, you have many, many third parties. Accenture works with companies throughout the economy, many different sectors. And the way that their value chains, their supply chains play out is very different for each one. But I mean, how should a company think about prioritizing those third parties? Rachel, why don't you take that?
There are, I'd be interested in Paul's view on this too. There are services, there are organisations like our own who help clients through that maze, if you like, by doing assessments, sitting down, going through the standards. But there is an order of priority too in terms of criticality. So which are the vendors that are touching your most vulnerable data, which have access to your networks? I mean, there's a number of suppliers we'll work with who don't get anywhere near our networks and infrastructure. So clearly they are much less risk in the context of this. It's also about how do you, if you're a global company, how do you know which standard or framework to work with? I think there is an emerging trend for people to be using NIST more. We're seeing that. But across the US, there's different state standards, there's different federal-related standards. In the EU, we obviously have EU directives too, and I think that can be very difficult for organisations to navigate. So we will help clients with that type of assessment. Our own CISO has to make that type of assessment too, and I'm sure, Paul, when you're working out what your priorities are, that's something that you have to think through very carefully.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, just a point on that, and my answer to this is very simple. You cannot apply 100% security to all of your assets. It's too costly, it's too complex, and it's not scalable. So our principle behind that is we identify what matters most, and we layer in our efforts behind that. So it's almost like an 80-20 principle. So rather than trying to protect 100% of all your assets all the time, put 80% of your focus on 20% of what's most critical. And I think that approach has certainly worked.
And at Ethisphere, we also work with companies on assessing their cyber risk. And for those of you that hear the term NIST and are not sure what it is, it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce that worked across an industry group in 2013 and 2014 to develop a framework that is 98 controls that an organization should have in place to manage cyber risk. And it's gotten a lot of attention around the world, but really it's a framework that embodies the ISO 27001 standard as well as other standards. So it has a lot of flexibility and agility, but at least it has a stake in the ground in saying these are 98 controls that companies should measure their capabilities against.
Yeah, and I'd say for folks that are evaluating frameworks is that, certainly in global companies where in EMEA we might have more of an alliance or, tend to move towards the ISO series where the US is NIST. The standard information gathering, the SIG questionnaires have been really useful for us to adopt a holistic program globally. So, I'd encourage, looking at all frameworks, to try and map your controls back to, something like SIG, which is very useful as well, standard information gathering.
So you have this complex information security environment, these threat actors, and we have increasingly a better educated set of directors on boards who are asking more questions internally of companies about cyber capabilities, wanting data to be able to measure against on an ongoing basis. How do you see that dynamic now? So it's sort of a top-down, and from all sides, organizations are really having to be able to demonstrate their capabilities.
Yeah, I think boards have come a long way. I still think there is work to do, and I think that comes down to us as professionals as well in terms of the conversations that we're having with boards. I think, you know, historically, when a CISO talked to a board, it was, you know, talking about vulnerabilities, threats, consequences, exploits, and, you know, that language doesn't relate to a board. And how we now talk to boards about business impact, cybersecurity risk tied to business process forces better questions from the board and better conversations and better asks on me. So the questions I'm starting to get asked by leadership and boards are moved away from, how is our response? You know, it's more, where do we invest? Where do we look at our capabilities and where do we need to move this forward to support our business strategies? So I think certainly the conversations are evolving, but there's always work to do in that space. Crucially important.
Yeah, I back that statement up. I'm seeing certainly some very good dialogue developing between CISOs and chief risk officers, for example. Whereas if I look back probably 24 or 36 months ago, it was a fairly one-dimensional conversation with CISOs. So we are seeing a greater involvement from board, particularly chief risk officers, who are really more focused now on what is the commercial appetite to sustain this risk, to carry this risk, and what is our tolerance in terms of dollars, euros, pounds. What can the business sustain here as a commercially palatable outcome if something were to go wrong? So we're seeing a lot more of that conversation develop, and I think it's challenging. The CROs are challenging CISOs' storyboard around, IT security, data standards, frameworks, and so on. I think that's a healthy environment.
Yeah, and sorry, I was just going to touch on that because the important point is your risk appetite. The board sets the risk appetite for the organization. So, how are you benchmarking your control environment, your processes, your security and your cybersecurity governance against your risk appetite? And having those conversations at board level, whether you're meeting, exceeding, or you have risks. And I think the measurements in how we use to enforce those conversations are crucially important. So what cyber risk indicators are we bringing to boards? They have to be leading indicators tied to business outcomes, not low-level metrics tied to vulnerabilities and so.
I agree. I think the dialogue has completely changed at board level. It's a much more sophisticated conversation. Awareness at board level has really changed over the last few years with regard to cybersecurity. CISOs are having interactions and security services providers are having interactions now at CEO level. This is not always a CISO or CTO sort of technology conversation. It's a business risk conversation. Given the reputational risk, the operational impact cyber incidents can have. So I think that's a really positive change. In terms, also, board members increasingly, particularly in regulated industries, have some duty with regard to cybersecurity. So they are personally in the hot seat, and they care very much about compliance and ethics and the responsibilities that go around with those duties. From my own company's perspective, from Accenture, I think we have an interesting friction, if you like, really. The board is obviously very interested in our own risk posture, in how we are managing risk, how our CISO, Andy Vautier, and his organisation are doing that, but also our security services business, what I support, talking to Kelly Bissell. They will invite him on a quarterly basis to talk to them about how we are managing risk in providing these services in a changing litigation, changing regulatory and environmental landscape. And I think all of that creates a much more sophisticated dialogue.
We're going to open it up to the audience for questions in just a minute, but you've had some very positive comments, Rachel, that not all gloom and doom. What else are you seeing? I mean, all of you have been in this space for a while. Things are very challenging, but also the ability to manage this risk has also matured.
Yeah, it has certainly. I think we had a joke outside. I think I've seen cybersecurity go from the basement to the board in a number of years, which is, really interesting. And I think the way business leaders value us as strategic advisors, given the nature of digital transformation in today's business ecosystem. So security is no longer a basement trade; it's now a boardroom trade. So it's good that we're moving in that direction to support business strategy. So it is very positive, but the accountabilities are huge. Mm-hmm. So that means obviously more investment, more planning, more capabilities in an environment where staff skills and shortages are hard to come across. So I think overall we've seen it's pleasing to see where security has come over the last 10 years, where it is, treated as a top business priority. So, it's up to us to make sure that we can deliver on those objectives. So yeah, it's pleasing to see.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in the insurance market, we're seeing that translating into an increasing uptake in the purchasing of cyber insurance coverage. And that's largely born out of the fact that a lot of companies are really embracing their understanding of cyber risk and getting to a level of comfort where they feel they can talk to external providers, such as insurance companies, to walk them through what is actually going on within their business. And if I go back about 5 years ago, they were tough conversations. Many companies were very careful about what they were saying to insurance carriers around their cyber threat postures. But I can see it firsthand. There's been a significant uptick in interest in the purchasing of cyber coverage. And probably GDPR has had a part to play in that, but I wouldn't hang everything on the role GDPR has had to play. I do genuinely believe that organizations, based on the comments you're hearing today, at board level, the responsibilities at board level around understanding their cyber exposures, their responsibilities to data protection in particular, are really elevated. They're very, very high visibility items right now at board level. They're probably, if not the number one, close to the number one watched item on the risk logs for many businesses and organizations. So from my side as a representative of AIG, but certainly on behalf of the insurance industry, we're delighted to see that businesses are really embracing this and understanding it and realizing that, you can lay this risk off, you can take it off your balance sheet. There are solutions available to remove the financial impacts of these events from the business, and that's the role that the insurance market plays. It is to actually cushion and smooth those events from the balance sheet. So yeah, that is a positive from our side. We are seeing an uptick in the purchasing of cyber insurance.
I think a couple of positives I would mention. First of all, cyber resilience really is improving. Of course, it's a constant battle between the good guys and the bad guys, but actually, despite IoT and the interconnectedness of the world that we all live in, some of the technology that potentially has contributed, if not caused the problem, is actually also being used to remedy the problem. So in a recent study we did of 1,000 security senior professionals across 1,000 organizations globally, I think 83% of them felt very confident that actually emerging and new technology, the AI and machine learning tools, for example, are going to be part of the solution to the problem. And that's why businesses like our own are focusing so heavily on innovation and developing tools to combat the malicious code. So I think there is a good news out there.
And a lot more training and communication that organizations are doing with their employee base and their third parties. So let's open it up if you have questions for our panelists. Stefan has the mic.
Hi there, Pete Davies from EY. Just a question about, you mentioned about coming out of the basement and going into the boardroom and articulating these risks to the board, that's a real shift and things are happening. When you look at the other risks that peers around that board table may be articulating to the board, so supply chain risk, bribery and corruption, liquidity, all those kind of other risks, what do you think that the cybersecurity industry can learn from them in how they articulate those risks and get those understandings across to a board who are perhaps not so technically competent as the people trying to explain them?
It's a great question, and if I look at the cross collaboration at that level you take, you mentioned other types of risks, like insider risk is something that you know, we, as a cybersecurity capability, you know, the skill sets, the approaches, and the methodologies actually translate across multiple disciplines. By nature, security people are investigative. They're, you know, curious, but, you know, the skills translate and support other areas, and that's what, you know, insider risk is another huge operational risk for organizations, and that is something that, you know, we at Dell are, you know, managing through our programs and understanding, you know, how we manage that type of risk. So that's one example.
Could I respond to that too? I think really interesting question, and I think that there's a cross-functional element to it. So I work with a lot of engineers and also highly technical security professionals. The most capable, in my view, and obviously very helpful to the role I play, is the ones that can use examples and speak to me, you know, in a non-technical way. And they feel the same about legal advice. You know, I will be much more helpful to them if I can break things down, not because these people aren't highly intelligent, because they are, but because they want things simplified, they want to hear the story behind something, they want to understand not the legal jargon, but what am I conveying to them. And I think within a board, it's really important. I think lawyers are very fortunate actually at the moment. I think compliance professionals also really fortunate, because the better we are at collaborating and communicating, the better we, you know, help our GCs have those conversations with other members of C-suite and the board, the more effective we can all be. And I think there is very much a cross-collaboration piece, learning from each other in advance of those, you know, preparing together in advance of those discussions too, so that there is a common framework to work from. And I think there's very much learning to be had from all the people around the board table and their own perspectives and how they communicate those perspectives.
Thank you. Tom Finnick for Bayer. Great segue to two questions, actually. What do you see in your client base in terms of the organizational structures? Is the IT security team somewhat embedded into the compliance and risk functions, or are they operating separately? And secondly, in terms of all the issues that you've touched upon, which require internal investigations, are those run also independently by the IT security experts, or are they embedded into the internal investigations framework of your clients?
I'll comment on that. Thanks for that question. So it's a bit of a hybrid, but we are generally seeing more infiltration of IT forensics in the business processes, really at the planning stage. So for example, if we look at M&A activity, which I know Rachel played to your agenda, if we look at M&A activity, for example, we're seeing at very early stages in that M&A process an effort to embed the IT security people in that process. So trying to do a deeper analysis of the entity that's been purchased and the data ownership and so on. And really trying to peel back what are the different layers of that organization at a very, very early stage. If, and God forbid, it ever does go wrong following an M&A and something, and we have seen examples actually of scenarios which did go wrong. Having that integrated approach at that very early stage is actually a key secret ingredient for responding to the event, because you've now got the embedded understanding of that risk exposure at a very early stage. Therefore, the remediation action is accelerated. That would be the case if you hadn't got embedded influence at the very outset. You are generally in a catch-up phase, and it's quite chaotic at that point. So, you know, going back to the NIST cybersecurity framework about that respond and recover piece, it is such a fundamental, important part of getting business operation capability back in place as quickly as possible. So if we have that early intervention, it actually adds some significant value when we do have a crisis unfold.
To your point as well, so within Accenture ourselves, absolutely our compliance function and our information security team very, very closely aligned. So I'll give you some examples. Things like our client data protection program, the InfoSec personnel work very closely with our data privacy team. They'll work with other regulatory and compliance teams. That's just one example. We also have a cyber working group. That's something actually I've really pushed for as well, because InfoSec has always been really strong, I would say, at Accenture. Touch wood, because we all know it's a very difficult job, and I have huge respect for CISOs and the complexity that they manage. But there is learning when you sell security services. There is also learning from that. So getting multidisciplinary teams together to think about, okay, how is our risk emerging in this space? What is the litigation landscape? How are clients responding to this? What are we selling to clients? You know, what is best in practice? Are we performing what's best in practice ourselves? So I think the more joined up organizations can be, the more working groups they have around this, absolutely the better. It makes us better at doing our jobs. And I think the insights we bring to, actually, also really help the business do theirs.
I'll just add one point to that. I know certainly in our program, what we're starting to see actually is a shift in regulation where organizations who operate within the 3 lines of defense, where IT security sat in the first line, we're seeing a shift of that into the second line. So as I'm building out policies for the organization, you know, who is overseeing the implementation and embedding of the policies. So actually from that side of things, certainly financial services, we're starting to see a shift of security and compliance in the second line function.
And we have been tracking this actually with the Business Ethics Leadership Alliance members, our BELA members, and we do see some interesting trends. Dell, for example, the CISO reports to the General Counsel, and we see increasing numbers where the CISO is reporting to the General Counsel or the Chief Compliance Officer. That said, I think the predominant positioning now is probably still in the IT world, but we do see that shift happening. Just on the investigatory capabilities, I think companies are really shoring up their investigative capacity, and then the kinds of monitoring that companies are doing with respect to their employee base on an ongoing basis, the compliance teams are very much engaged with. So a lot of shifting is going on. It's something we're tracking very closely because the compliance community, the legal community are very much getting more integrated into these issues. I think maybe one more question?
I think we're right on time. So
Okay.
we should encourage the conversation to keep going on the break.
So we'll be up here if you have any questions during the break. Thank you all very much, and thank you. Please, a hand for my panelists.